Meu nome é Joaquim Caraí, nome indígena, Benite. Eu sou um liderança também que faço parte da comissão, né? A gente vê a necessidade, né, de plantar mais, mas não para comércio, para consumo mesmo, né? Cada família tem sua rocinha, mas muitas vezes não dá para o ano, né? São pequenas áreas. Que a gente tem maioria das plantas que é da floresta, que dá fruta, né? Pitanga, coquinho, bastante raiz, então tudo isso para nós é importante. Quando você entra no mato, primeiro você vai respeitar aqueles pés de árvore maior para você seguir o seu caminho. Você pode ir para qualquer lugar que você vai se encontrar. Então essa árvore aqui é importante para a gente que mora aqui dentro da aldeia com respeito, e logo na entrada, primeira árvore que a gente encontra no caminho, o maior pé de árvore que a gente encontra, para nós, respeitamos muito, porque ele é como uma segurança logo na entrada, no caminho. Às vezes a gente chega no rio, você não vai chegar no rio com sede e vai chegar correndo e vai querer beber uma água. Primeiro você vai chegar e você vai parar, né? Então você tem que chegar e se concentrar para chegar a beber uma água. Porque o espírito são vivos, que quando acompanha pelo som da pedra, o som da cachoeira, é no sentido que eles estão conversando, né? Você pode fechar o olho, se concentrar um momento. Tudo isso é um espírito que a gente tem que respeitar. Você não sabe o que você vai atravessar no seu caminho. É ali onde você vai abrir a sua visão e você pode estar seguindo em frente tranquilo. Tudo tem sentido para ser bem recebido pela natureza, né?
Ministério do Turismo e Associação Casa Azul apresentam 19ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. O projeto se beneficia da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, Vale Mais Cultura. Tem patrocínio oficial do Itaú e Instituto Cultural Vale. Realização: Associação Casa Azul, Secretaria Especial da Cultura, Ministério do Turismo, Pátria Amada Brasil, Governo Federal. Esta mesa terá a duração de aproximadamente 1 hora e foi excepcionalmente gravada com antecedência. Por isso, não haverá espaço para perguntas do público. A transmissão pela internet é realizada em 3 canais: áudio original, português e inglês. Selecione abaixo a opção de sua preferência. Boa Flip!
books, the most famous of which is probably the Mars trilogy. Stan's books he tries to imagine not just the future, which is what science fiction does, but future based on a climate crisis that we're experiencing in Anthropocene, with information, not only scientific information, in other words, based on biology, ecology, and astronomy and technology, also fields such as economics and political science. Stan's books are frequently described as utopian books and not dystopian books like most science fiction is. Welcome, Stan. It's a huge pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. Your last book, which we're going to discuss, is The Minister of the Future, published in 2020, which is still not been translated into Portuguese. So thank you very much for joining us today, Stan.
Thank you, Lucia. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I can immediately say that I'm happy to be talking to a Brazilian audience. I've just returned from the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland. And the Amazon was a big topic of discussion there, as well as forests worldwide, very important in the fight to control climate change. So yes, my Ministry for the Future is about that whole process, and it's why I was at COP26, why I was invited to be there by the UK hosts. But I also know that my previous novel, New York 2140, has been translated in Brazil. So possibly that would be another one. That too is a novel about climate change, and it's at least possible that your audience will be more familiar with that one because of the translation.
Sim, muito obrigada.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And the other guest is Eliane Brum, a journalist who has been in our computers and homes as a columnist for different newspapers in El País. She has a column that we all read, El País. Eliane is the author of 8 books, including a novel, 1 or 2, and the genre is more difficult to describe. They include journalism, investigative journalism, autobiography, interviews, but especially their books of deep analysis of Brazil, especially the various different peripheries of Brazil, to use a problematic term, or the Amazon, which is the place which in recent years that she chose to live in. Eliane describes herself as a listener who writes. Her last book, which has just been launched and that we're going to be discussing today, is Okotó, Bandeira Okotó. Welcome, Eliane, and it's great to have you with us with this beautiful landscape behind you of near the Xingu River. So thank you very much, Lucia. Hello, one and all, Lucia, Stan. It's a huge pleasure to be with you today and to be here talking from the Amazon forest. I'm talking from Altamira, from the forest near the Xingu River. It's fascinating. As Stan said, he just came from COP26. I attended it from the Amazon, from my perspective in the Amazon. One of the most interesting things and tragic things to a certain extent is to see how the leaders, indigenous leaders here from the Xingu River basin where I live, and from the Amazon as a whole, and from all over Brazil, had unprecedented leadership in COP26. At the same time, while they were there speaking about the Amazon and talking about the climate change, the indigenous peoples have anticipated this challenge much far before the scientists here in the Amazon. Here on the ground, the violence was unbridled, increasing violence, and these indigenous leaders who were on the stage at COP26 in Scotland, they were attacked immediately when they came back to Brazil, like Alexandra Munduruku, who, as soon as she arrived in Brazil, her home was invaded and raided, and there were with burnings and fires. So it was interesting how what happened in on the stage and what happens on the ground in the Amazon, which is the impasse that we're experiencing with the urgency of the climate collapse. So for me, I'm very happy to be talking to you here from the Amazon itself. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much, Eliane. And what a tragedy we're experiencing in Brazil with this government, and that our indigenous leaders have come back to Brazil with this terrible situation. Stan, I would like for you to talk a little bit about the strong sense of place in your work. And I'm going to apologize to begin with a personal anecdote of my own. Last week, I participated in an academic event in Zurich, and I took your book, The Ministry of the Future, for the Future, to read on my trip. After the event was over, there was this terrible fog in Zurich. You couldn't see the mountains from there, and I decided to read your book in the hotel room. I hadn't started reading it yet, and I discovered to my surprise that your book takes place in Zurich. And most of the book takes place in Zurich. What a coincidence. In one of the paragraphs, actually, you began by saying that in November in Zurich, there's a terrible fog and drizzle all over the place, and you can't even see the mountains. And I thought to myself, this book is talking to me personally. And from that point on, I began to talk to my friends, my Swiss friends, who took me to see the house or the street where Mary Murphy, the main character, lives, and other places which I saw in your book. In other words, I used your book as a kind of tourist guide in Zurich, and I went to visit the statue of Gadamed on the edge of the lake where so many conversations play out. Could you tell us a little bit about this sense of place? Your book is a book which deals with the planet Earth as this global nature of our planet, but at the same time, it takes place in Zurich very strongly. Why Zurich? Why did you pick Zurich? Of course, there's the issue of power. Geneva and several different international institutions have their headquarters in Switzerland. But why Zurich? Tell us a little bit about that, if you can, this sense of place.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Lucia. And it's a beautiful coincidence that you were reading Ministry for the Future in Zurich. My wife is a chemist. And when we were young, her postdoc appointment, when she finished her doctorate at UC Davis, was in Zurich at the ETH. So we lived there for 2 years. When we were young, we didn't have children, we didn't have responsibilities, and it was our first time in Europe. It was my first time where I was a full-time writer, writing novels rather than being a teacher. So it was a very romantic time for us, and it lasted a couple of years. Well, I've never had the opportunity to write about it, but when I came to Ministry for the Future, I knew that I wanted the UN and the Paris Agreement force to be my protagonist. And although it is a global novel that discusses situations all over the world, as a novel per se, it needed to have a home base, a local habitation and a name, as Shakespeare called it. And so I decided to make it Zurich instead of Geneva, because for one thing, Zurich and Geneva are rivals in Switzerland, friendly rivals, maybe, like maybe Rio or Sao Paulo, or like Los Angeles and San Francisco. And also Geneva is overfilled with UN agencies already. So it seemed to me obvious that I could put one of them in Zurich and it would look okay. And then I could write about a place that I know and a place that I've loved. And I must say, the book has had a wonderful response in Zurich. It's been noticed there. I have spoken to the local radios and written columns for the daily newspaper in Zurich and made connections with friends that we hadn't heard from for 35 years. So it has been a beautiful aspect of that book to have that reconnection. And we hope to go back for a month or two and visit again. It would be a kind of return to our youthful selves.
Uhum. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Stan. Eliane, in your case, the sense of place and what gives meaning to the book, the sense of place, what gives meaning to the book is the Amazon, of course, and your move to Altamira, the importance of living in the Amazon, and not only living rather in the Amazon, but living Amazon, not living in Amazon, but living Amazon, to make yourself Amazonian in that sense, and to become Amazonian. In a sense, Altamira is the opposite of Zurich. It's a European city where we can see the robust institutions and institutions which, as the Stan's book states very clearly, are institutions that are built with the dirty money from the peripheries of the world, but solidity and safety and security, which is the opposite of Altamira. Can you talk to us a little bit about the sense of place in your book and the Amazon in itself? Yes, of course. In a sense, the ruins of Altamira and the Amazon are determined by cities, world conceptions like that of Zurich. And although we do not glimpse solid buildings, they're not much less solid than they appear. My book, it tells the story of a reportage of almost 25 years, which is the trajectory, which I've been a reporter for more than 30 years, but I've covered the Amazon in the plural sense for almost 25 years. In 2017, I moved to the Amazon, to Altamira, which is one of the epicenters of the destruction of the Amazon forest. Okay, fine. Why did I come here? I came here precisely to defend, together with several other people, the Amazon is not the periphery. Zurich is the periphery. From this point of view, Amazon is one of the centers of this world, one of the main centers of this world. In my view, this moment where we're confronting the climate emergency, confronting mass destruction of species, both caused by action, human action, but there's a trap there because not the action by all humans, although humans, as if humans, for this discussion, as if there was something homogeneous, like a club, this select club of humanity. It was caused by a minority, a dominant minority of humans. So at this moment, it's determinate and mandatory for us to acknowledge the legitimacy of the true centers of the world, which are the natural sources of support, like the oceans and the forest, the tropical forests, where the Amazon is the largest of these tropical forests. So at a certain point, this happened to me in 2016. It came to me, if I defend that the Amazon is the center of the world, so as a journalist, how come I'm not in the center of the world? It occurred to me, it came to me. So I believe that this shift of what the center and the periphery is, it has to be done in actual fact. It has to be out of coherence. I had to make this move and shift to stop covering the planet and Brazil itself, the southeast of Brazil, and have to cover it from the Amazon, from a different point of view, a new point of view. This other multi-centric world where the natural sources of support for life are the centralities of this world. And Lucia and Stan, it's not only a geographic move, it is a geopolitical move in the sense that what is at the center is also another kind of thinking, with the idea that it will not be the thinking, Western thinking of a predominantly European matrix and hues in the United States, binary, patriarchal, predominantly male, which is exactly the kind of thinking of inhabiting the planet that brought us to the abyss of the climate emergency and the destruction of the species that we're going to leave this abyss. Well, needs to become central in occupies centrality. And COP26 showed this is another kind of thinking of the indigenous peoples, the original peoples. They're not homogeneous either. And the indigenous peoples, the river-dwelling people, the maroon communities, and the peoples of nature, the peoples since their ancestors, in the case of the Amazon, a lot of people don't know, part of the Amazon, scientifically proven, was planted by the ancestors of the current indigenous peoples. These peoples, it's their thinking, the people who live with nature, because they don't belong, or the nature doesn't belong to them. They are nature. They've lived for thousands of years without destroying the planet. They're the ones who should be at the central position of the debates. So the Amazon is the center of the world. It's a movement, it's a concept, it's a motif for my book, which led me to this move in the deepest sense of reforestation and becoming Amazonian, this shift of centrality, not as a concession, because this are legitimate issues that claim to legitimacy of this other centrality. Thank you very much, Eliane. Based on this discussion of place and the importance of place and where each of the books takes place, Stan, could you, we already know that part of your novel, an important part of the novel takes place in Zurich, but could you talk to the Brazilian readers a little bit more about the book, of course, without any spoilers, but could you describe a little bit your novel, give us like a teaser of our readership here from Flip, the Parachi Festival.
Sure, thank you. It would be my pleasure. I want to first say, to acknowledge the truth of what Eliane was telling us. And I want to say that not just at COP26, but in general, in American culture, the Amazon is known as the lungs of the world. And I think this is a good image. And there is awareness of the importance of the Amazon as a giant force in the world's biospheric balances. And there's immense worry about the deforestation and destruction there. So this is widely known worldwide. Then to my book, well, I'm a Californian, and there's a very important strand of my ministry for the future that uses California as a model for how to intelligently integrate human civilization into its local landscape. That hasn't been true in California in its historical past, but recently a progressive majority has ruled in California and has essentially returned all the groundwater in the state to a kind of a commons. So communal ownership of water is a new thing that, or a return to an old thing that promises that what little water California has will at least be a public utility that is owned by society in general rather than by private ownership. So this is a subtle move towards post-capitalism, very necessary and important. No matter how good the social reaction is to the water situation in California, we still face devastating droughts. So I think for every place in the world, there will be its own particular climate change catastrophe bearing down on it now. So in California, we have drought, we have fires. 15% of all of the giant sequoias on Earth have burned to death in the last 2 years in California fires. So our forests are also suffering from dryness. And it's not so much the attack of capitalist exploitation of the land, it's the accidental repercussions of earlier exploitation that is now simply torching the forests. So in my novel, to get back to your original question, I'm sorry, I try to tell the story of the world community organizing itself to do the right things to get through this century without a mass extinction event. In other words, a best case scenario future history covering about 30 years. It has its international and global elements. It has lots of local elements to illustrate how that would look in individual situations. And I try to make it realistic enough that the reader can still believe it, even though the ultimate outcome 30 years from now is actually quite good. So in that sense, it's still a utopian novel. It's just that the definition of utopia has been lowered to this: if we survive, that's utopian. So that's what the Ministry for the Future is about.
Ok. Muito obrigada, Stan. Eliane.
Thank you indeed, Stan. Eliane, the same thing. In other words, I began with localization of the book, which is totally connected to your location. You made the decision to move to the center of the world in the Amazon. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book per se? How would you describe your book for the participants in FLIP, the Paraty International Literary Festival? Before I describe my book, I would just like to make a comment based on what Stan just said concerning the issue of water and water as a collective good. And we here in the middle Xingu Basin, where I live, we're living the opposite of that, because we have the Belmonte hydroelectric power plant, which is controlling now a major portion of the water and one of the largest rivers in the Amazon, which is the Xingu River, Xingu. So we're living this madness, insanity in the middle of a climate emergency, and Amazon is reaching the point of no return. We have a company, which is Norte Energia, is taking over the water and drying up an ecocide in Volta Grande do Xingu, this region, 120 kilometers, which is the living place of the indigenous peoples, the Uja people, the Arara, and Memendocre, Xikrin peoples, as river-dwelling and agroecological farmers. There's an ecological crisis. They're drying up 120 kilometer stretch precisely because the water is treated as a resource, a private resource, as the water is treated as a merchandise or commodity. Water also, and in the same region, there is a mining company, a Canadian mining company called Belson Mining, attempting to open it up in the same region, which is Volta Grande do Xingu, which is already in a process of ecocide, which what they called is the largest open air gold mine in Brazil, which is going to create a mountain of toxic mine trailings the size of 2 Sugarloaf mountains, and this on the geological faults, as in the place of 2 geological faults that intersect. This is in the region where I live. So, talking about this issue, water is treated like a commodity rather than being treated as something live as part of the planet, which doesn't belong to anybody, or it shouldn't. It belongs to everybody. Concerning my book, Lucia, my book, it is an invitation, an appeal, and a call to people to take this same path, this long path. No, not everyone has had the opportunity to make this choice that I did, partly because my profession as a journalist, I was able to. So it's as if I would like to invite people to take this path of how I learned and discovered the Amazon and discovered its peoples. and as being impacted and changed by the experience, how I became Amazonian in this process, which I call my Amazonization and my reforestation, which is in process now. I tell people for them to be able to follow me on this journey, because this book is also a call to the struggle. As I just said, the Amazon is close to the point of no return, on the verge. It's not just a matter of decades, it's a matter of years if we continue on this same accelerated destruction. Bolsonaro is just hidden the deforestation. It's the most serious deforestation in the last 15 years. And the numbers were in a process, an accelerated process of destruction in the Amazon. And if there's not an alliance for the Amazon, in other words, the Amazon needs to be in Brazil and in the world a priority for all of us when we wake up until we go to sleep. So it's a call to the struggle. It's a path, a journey of the way that I understand myself in this process, and I'm transformed in this process as I become, because I say that we need to quickly become another kind of people to be capable of creating together as a community who's struggling for the common good, another kind of society with another kind of thinking, another kind of way of inhabiting the world. So this is the journey for people to dive into this journey, and to, who knows, maybe we'll find another way. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Stan, you were a student and a disciple of the great Ursula Le Guin, and the topic, you know, the Paraty International Literary Festival. This edition is the plant world. In your last book, of course, you talk about plants and the plant world, especially through agriculture and some forests that are being destroyed. But the relationship between humans in your books and the non-humans, or as Eliane would say, some of the more than humans, doesn't happen so much with the plants, but with the large mammals. But thinking of the theme of this flip, could you tell us a little bit about your relationship in science fiction and fantasy and the plant world, all the way from the forest and Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin, for example?
Sure. One of the great strengths and beauties of science fiction is that it doesn't just focus on human beings, but includes in its area of interest and its plots the planet itself. This strand of science fiction called the planetary romance was where Ursula K. Le Guin began her career with her first 5 novels. And her novel, The Word for World is Forest, is still very influential in ecological circles. So she was the great mama bear, being Ursula, for our whole movement, green science fiction, ecological science fiction, for us who live in that genre. She is the great leader. And she's part of a tradition, as she would have instantly pointed out. In my novel, Ministry for the Future, I emphasize the idea that we as humans need to exist as part of a larger body, that we are like bees in a beehive, and that the rest of the biosphere is not just interesting or having its own integrity, but is also our body itself extended outwards, that we can't live without a healthy biosphere. So in my novel, the way that I formalized this as a international plan had to do with the scientist E.O. Wilson's 50 half Earth plan, it's called. I was thinking 50%, but it's called Half Earth. And it proposes that we need to leave at least half of the Earth's surface to the wild animals, and to its own life cycles, so that the plants too, the entire watershed or biosphere would be half left to the humans would leave that land entirely. And this was a radical plan, but in my novel, it's being used as a guideline because I think it's necessary if we want to dodge the mass extinction event that we are beginning right now. And it's probably one of the more radical proposals in my novel. And I wrote that novel in 2019. And since the pandemic, you've seen the United States under the Biden administration make a commitment to emptying 30% of the United States of human presence. And the European Union has done the same as part of their green recovery. I confess that I am astonished that such a proposal has been taken up so quickly by ordinary political leaders. And it's encouraging to me that the world community is beginning to acknowledge that the forests and the wild spaces and the wild animals are citizens in a larger political organization, which includes humans, but is not simply made up of humans. So these developments are happening fast, but of course the destruction of capitalism is happening maybe even faster. So we're in a race between some kind of restoration of balance with the biosphere and a destruction of the biosphere so severe that we won't be able to recover from it, because extinction is final. When species go extinct, they aren't coming back. And if in 100 years we've killed off most of the large mammals and many of the smaller species, what humans survive that devastation will not be able to restore what came before. So we are in an emergency. And I well remember the anger and despair of being in a country where someone like Trump was president, representative of pathological destructiveness, of a Götterdämmerung, the gods damning the world and killing everything as they see they're going down to defeat. This psychological aberration is hard to deal with, but I can offer some hope to Brazilians. Trump lost the election. The Biden administration is very energetically pursuing a Franklin Delano Roosevelt type New Deal and great presidency. It's a tough task, but a new political leadership. And of course, looking at other countries, you can never see them properly. But when I look at Brazil and I think back to the first years of Lula, I'm thinking Brazil too could change quickly and fundamentally by way of politics, ordinary politics going well. So I offer my encouragement, and I can say that and also coming from California with a strong progressive majority for decades, you can see that politics matters and that quick changes can happen if you have the right political economy in control of things. So I wish you the best on that front.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Stan. Eliane, I don't know if you would like to answer what Stan has just said about the Brazilian government. I would also like for you to tell us a little bit about, in this topic of plants, about your use of the term to enforest, so to speak. It's difficult for the translator. It's like a neologism, enforesting oneself, or to become forest, something like that, which is this idea of if the planet has a future, we need to enforest ourselves, so to speak. The population that's been displaced by the Belmont they were deforested in that sense. these terms that you use, she was referring to the Belmont hydroelectric dam. The people in the Amazon are part of the forest. They are the forest. Could you tell us a little bit about this? If you would like to answer a little bit what Stan has just said about what he has just said in his comparisons between the transition from Trump to Biden and our unfortunate, still unfortunate destiny of having Bolsonaro as the president of the country. Of course, that'd be a pleasure. Okay, first to say that with regard to what the analysis that Stan has just done, I agree totally with what on the issue that the climate emergency, to confront the climate emergency, which is something that's happening because of confronting, involves confronting racial inequality, gender inequality, and also species inequality. Humans need to leave this centrality, their centrality. Meanwhile, I disagree very fundamentally with what he says on the issue that to leave part of the planet to the animals, to the other species, because I believe that this comes from an idea, a white idea, an idea that a type, as if humans were something homogeneous, as if to say human, the word human would describe what we all are or who we all are. Not. The planet has been destroyed by a dominant minority of humans. I think it's essential to make this clear, to be able to confront what we're dealing with. And the production of the climate emergency and mass species destruction is a dominant minority, basically consisting of billionaires and trillionaires and their executives and their lobbyists and all of their entourage, their elected dictators like Trump and Bolsonaro, the elected dictators and the representatives of the large corporations. So it was not all the humans, far from it, who led to the climate emergency. There are many types of humans. And in the forests, in other biomes, and other natural life support systems, these humans, whom I call my book, the peoples of nature, are the humans who, in the case of the Amazon, they planted parts of the forest. The humans who, for millennia, have lived, in some cases, for centuries, in the case of other peoples, have lived with the forest without destroying it. So to say about removing, for example, to free lands, if I understood properly, but this is what the preservationists defend, because there's a large discussion about conservationists and preservationists, that removing indigenous peoples and river-dwelling peoples, removing the maroon communities, these humans, is something that would be extremely climate injustice, because these humans don't destroy the natural enclaves of life. These humans are part of the natural enclaves of life. They are not, they don't belong. In other words, they aren't the owners of nature. Neither do they belong to nature. It's much deeper than that. They are nature. So I believe that no fight against, or that's why I defend a change in the centrality of thinking. It always involves it's a part of without the leadership from all these peoples that have always lived with nature, and they understand the planet as an exchange, a constant exchange amongst everything that's living, amongst humans and non-humans, between the visible and invisible, where they're part of it. They don't understand the planet as part of civilization, and this civilization of the Western approach. Eliane's connection is choppy. They're in a constant exchange. So it's another way of understanding the world, and it's this way that has to become central in our fight, because this is the way, this way lives and inhabits the planet, being the planet. So that is what this centrality is about, which we propose. With regard to the government, the Bolsonaro government, so I think just to compliment, I think they have to be careful when we say we destroyed the planet that you're part of, and now we are going to tell you how we're going to save the planet, which we destroyed, not you. We destroyed. I think that these are the formulations. They're kind of complicated. Either we join with the peoples of the forest, it's either with the peoples of nature in understanding their way of life, or we won't make progress with regard to the Brazilian government. Bolsonaro is a genocide. I won't have enough time, but I think genocide is the proper word based on research and data. But the term genocide, it's an aberration. It's leading the Amazon and other biomes like the savanna and Pantanal to a point of no return. But we need to understand that Bolsonaro is a creature, is not a creator. Bolsonaro is the result of what has not been solved over the centuries of Brazil, like structural racism. Bolsonaro is exactly doing, he didn't suffer impeachment because he still serves the purpose for this dominant minority who are in this mystification called the market. In other words, because the main project of the Bolsonaro government is precisely to transfer the public lands which belong to everyone, that belong to the indigenous peoples and the conservation units, to land that can be commercialized and exploited in the hands of his friends and cronies in this minority. So this happens at two different levels: in the National Congress with a number of different bills, absurd bills, which can be passed, as several have been already, and in the ground, in the forest, where with blood shed. We need to understand that in the specific case of the Amazon, the view of the Amazon as a body for exploitation, for colonizing the Amazon, that you go to the forest with has nothing, as if it had nothing. It's a view which supposedly that it's nothing. It's just waiting to be exploited by the West. This view was built and constituted an imaginary view which is strongly rooted in the entire population in the military government from 1964 to 1979. Land for men, because these were men without land, as Bolsonaro said in his declaration, like a green desert. The Amazon is like a green desert. They don't even acknowledge the wealth of the Amazon or the wealth of the desert itself, which is extremely important biome itself. All of this was built as propaganda during the military dictatorship, and it still persists because this view has not changed with re-democratization. This view, there was no break in it. All of the governments after re-democratization, to a greater or lesser degree, viewed the Amazon as a green desert, a body to be exploited, and the peoples without right to self-determination, which would be because they're quote unquote primitive in their point of view. So this has led us to a government, for example, the most leftist government that we had in the history of Brazil, which was the PT, the Workers' Party government, had a government for the dictatorship, which is the hydroelectric dams in the Amazon, which was a disaster, which opened the gateways, the floodgates. So that we had to keep this in mind, because the solution, which is not guaranteed, but if Bolsonaro is defeated in next year, this same view can continue to exploit the Amazon, which to look at the ruralists, the agribusiness. A lot of governments have been dominated by the agribusiness. We had to break with this view of the Amazon as a body to be exploited, as if his people did not have right to self-determination, with his view of colonialists and extractivists. Thank you very much, Eliane. Thank you very much, Eliane. Stan, I learned that you had free pass to several different roundtables in the negotiations and for all the negotiating tables at COP26. And could you tell us a little bit about, for our listeners and the readers here from Flip, what you learned at COP26 with the negotiations? And before, I'd just like to mention that the photographs which are being shown together with the images of Eliane Brum, our photojournalist Lilio Careto, who we lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Stan, if you could tell us a little bit about your insights that you learned during your participation in COP26.
Sure. Happy to do that. Although first I want to briefly add to something inspired by what Eliane said. It's true that if you begin to make divisions between humans and the natural world and say, like Wilson did, that half of the earth should be left to the wild animals, it sounds like the old expulsion of indigenous peoples, which was a disaster. But I think what he meant comes from the context of being a North American. And what you have to understand or imagine is that the United States was a forest the size of the Amazon, and it has been entirely destroyed. So the destruction of forests came first, where the capability of industrial society was strongest. And the watershed of the Mississippi and the Missouri and Ohio rivers is as big as the Amazon, and it is entirely industrial agriculture. It is a factory floor that is in the open air where food is grown for profit, cash crops, and done in a way that brutalizes the earth, the natural animals, and of course the indigenous peoples were mostly killed by the start of the 20th century, by disease and also by murder. So it's from that historical context, you have to understand that the call for leaving half of the land to the wild animals would be talking about really a situation like North America, where you're looking at an industrial factory floor that where extinctions are going to happen to animals that have as much right to live as we do. And Wilson's point is that the land that humans need to support themselves with food is very much smaller than what has been destroyed for the sake of profit. So I'm completely with Eliane. The problem is capitalism and capitalists. The richest 2 or 5% of people on the planet are wrecking it for their own private gain. And it is not the fault or even the activities of the indigenous people or the poor people of the world or the developing countries, but rather a global capitalist system, which is one of the things that my novel tries to describe getting out of by getting through and beyond by way of the institution of a post-capitalism that in many respects resembles democratic socialism. But it has to have new aspects, it has to use finance, it has to use international treaties. So there isn't a good name for it, but let's just say a combination of leftism and environmentalism that is powerful and that gets us out of the capitalist trap of exploitation and destruction. So with that said, and with great appreciation for Eliane's comments, I want to describe briefly that Glasgow, there were 40,000 representatives of national governments. There were indigenous people from all around the world who were there to represent their causes. The Paris Agreement was very intelligently written to emphasize climate equity, which is to say that the rich nations that got their riches by way of colonial exploitation shall pay more to develop clean energy and sustainable livelihoods for the developing nations that are post-colonial and wrecked. This is fundamental to the Paris Agreement, and every nation signed on to it. There is, however, a flaw. That whole Paris Agreement and COP process, so we were at COP 26. For 26 years now, those meetings have run by consensus. Every nation has to agree to every sentence and every word. It makes it slow. I attended meetings where the meticulous discussion of individual words and commas was quite beautiful if you are a language person, if you're a writer, if you're an academic or an intellectual. The care that was being taken over sentences by maybe groups of 30 people arguing over one sentence, but politely, and just discussing, what does it mean? Can we sustain it? Will our government support it? A very famous example is right at the end, the agreement from COP26 was going to promise to phase out coal. And at the last moment, because of objections from China and India, it was changed to phase down coal. So these kind of changes are being argued. If we had a century, it would be impressive. It would be what we have as an international community. In other words, compared to not having the Paris Agreement, where we would be very much worse off, it's what we have to do this work. It's good work. It's too slow. We can't, through the Paris Agreement, get where we need to go fast enough without enormous pressure from the public on their political representatives to send people to the COP in Cairo, the next one after that in Abu Dhabi, of all places, to where hopefully in Dubai itself they will ban oil. That would be a nice irony. These meetings will not go fast enough because of their very structure unless the pressure from the world public is enormous on our political representatives, who are often bought by the fossil fuel industries, by corporate capitalism, such that instead of representing us or the biosphere, they're representing the special interests of the exploiters. So the battle in the next 5 years between what we know we need to do and the clear evidence that we're not doing it will lead to a world crisis where I hope mass demonstrations will force changes in government such that the COP process actually goes very much faster and bolder than it did in Glasgow, where, as admirable as it was, it also demonstrated the inadequacy of our current mindsets, and we're going too slow for the speed of the emergency.
Okay. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. We only have 5 more minutes of conversation, and Stan is going to have to leave at the end of the recording. So I'd just like to suggest that you, if you wish, make your final remarks, or want to ask a question to the other, beginning with Eliane Brum, if you'd like to make any final remarks and or a question for Stan. Eliane, that would be wonderful for us. So thank you very much. I wish to say, I got to recall a flip in 2014 when I interviewed the audience with Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, the anthropologist from Brazil, and he said a quote which is ontological, that the indigenous peoples, the world of the indigenous peoples in Brazil ended in 1500. The indigenous people lived the first end of the world in 1500 when the Europeans arrived, and they can tell us, despite everything that we did with their bodies, they can tell us how it is to live. How do you live after you live the end of the world? So I remember this phrase, it Flip itself, by Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, the anthropologist. We also need to look at resistance. If Brazil, the planet, is a planet traversed permeated by destruction, by the destruction of some peoples in the name of a minority. It's also a huge example of resistance. We have the indigenous peoples who had their first end of the world in the year 1500, and they've experienced numerous ends of the world, like COVID-19, including COVID-19. The indigenous peoples were in the 16th and 17th century, more than 90% of them were decimated by viruses coming from the European invaders, like smallpox, and that the blacks, the enslaved blacks who came from slave ships from different parts of Africa to Brazil, live in the formal abolition of slavery in Brazil was in 1888, and the first policy for inclusion of blacks in Brazil was in the Lula government administration, with a backlash by the elites. More than a century later, in Lula's government, and even so, the blacks are the majority of the Brazilian population. Even so, the indigenous peoples have increased their population, especially after the 1988 Constitution, the Citizens' Constitution. We have some intellectuals and examples, two examples that are interconnected. Monumental resistance, this limiting time at the edge of the abyss. We have to join forces with them. I have written that denialism is enrooted in the population, because it's easy to call Bolsonaro as a denialist, but he's a calculating denialist. But we are contradicting our own instincts, our most basic survival instincts, because given the climate emergency, if we had acted according to the survival instinct, we would not think of anything else than wake up in the morning and all day long until we go to sleep. We would not think of anything other than saving the Amazon and the other biomes. So there's nothing more important at this time here in Brazil than making this alliance, which places centrality in the Amazon in the lives of each and every one of us, and to have a community struggle for this common good, which is the Amazon forest, with everything that it represents, with all of its peoples, visible and invisible, human and non-human. And I would like to invite Stan to visit the Amazon forest. We are organizing here where I live an artistic residence, which will be happening next year, precisely for people to be able to come and learn and live the Amazon, and with their bodies in the Amazon, and to be able to struggle in a different way in the Amazon. So I'd like to invite you, Stan, to come next year. You'll be very welcome here with us. Thank you very much, Eliane. And Stan, would you like to answer Eliane or any final remarks? I know that you have short time, so feel free to speak briefly or whatever. Feel free. You're in charge.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm being kicked out of my hotel room, but it's a bit of a soft limit here, so I will speak for 5 minutes and then have to get out of here. Thank you, Eliane, for that introduction, and I would hope to take it up someday. My wife is a water chemist, and she's spent her career studying the fate of pesticides in the environment after they're used on crops. What happens to them in the surface streams? What happens to them in the groundwater? Some of her tables have combined something like 250 different chemical pesticides into one calculation to see what happens when they combine in the environment and what damage they do to the environment after they've been used to help industrial agriculture. So her maps of the great Midwest, the Mississippi watershed, as big as the Amazon, are entirely red with poison. So I bring her up because she's retiring from her job for the U.S. Geological Survey in the United States. And after that, we will be traveling together and we'll see what she wants to do. We have some plans, but it's mostly open because this is a new situation for us. I'm interested to think about, I'll say this. My home is California. I'm proud of it. I'm rooted there. I've just finished a nonfiction book about the High Sierra, the Sierra Nevada of California. I've just learned at COP26, I always knew that there were two Sierra Nevadas, that the original one was in Spain, and then the one in California, very much my heart's home. And I just learned that there's another one in Colombia, which is a beautiful thought. The snowy range, and whether it will stay snowy and climate change is hard to say. And it's part of the California climate disaster that what used to be snow may become rain, and therefore it won't be a natural reservoir much larger than any of the dammed reservoirs that humans build. So it's a scary situation, and I've finished that in my first nonfiction book, which I found much harder than I thought it would be. I really am a novelist. So I'm thinking forward, both in my life and my career, what to write about next. And I would say that because we are in a climate emergency, you have to think of your own watershed. And I'm wondering, since I do have to leave, I can only put this out as a prompt to you. Most people are not indigenous. There's 8 billion humans. There's far less than 1 billion of them are indigenous peoples. The rest of them are basically urban, settler colonials, or migrants, immigrants, or people that have lived in their place forever, but in an urban and modernized context. How can we convince them that they are part of a larger biosphere, that their bodies extend out into their watersheds upstream, and that the natural world is not a luxury item or an irrelevance, but are central to all of our health? It seems to me that the story is somehow not being persuasive enough to the urban populations that are now most of the people on Earth. How can we tell the story so that they get it? How will they integrate their lives as city dwellers? And most of us are living in civilization separate from the natural world in ways that obscure how false that separation is, how integrated with the natural world we really are. So a friend of mine, the American writer Richard Powers, he wrote The Overstory a few years ago. It was an immense bestseller in English, and I would not be surprised if it had been translated by Brazilian publishers into Portuguese, The Overstory. If not, surely it will be. It swept the world because it was about trees and humans' relationship to trees. And now Richard Powers is living in an old growth forest in eastern Tennessee. He's done like Eliane. He's moved into the forest to pursue his work as a writer and try to tell more stories and persuade the rest of the world. But in his personal life, he needs to be in the forest. Well, not everybody can do that. A lot of people are going to necessarily live in cities, and that will be good for the biosphere if humans are concentrated in green cities, but they need to have green mentalities. In the cities, they need to be aware of the watershed upstream. So in the Brazilian cities on the coast, the big ones, they need to be aware that the Amazon is part of their body and necessary for their health, and necessary for the world's health. So there's a special caretaker aspect to Brazil, because the Amazon is still a giant forest, viable, and in the tropics, it grows fast if it's left alone, etc. North America, we destroyed the Pacific Northwest tropical rainforest for lumber. We destroyed the great eastern hardwood forest to create agriculture. The the restoration work to bring the natural world back in North America is a different project than the sustenance and restoration work that is necessary to be done in Brazil. They have a similar point. They have a similar ethos and spiritual attitude towards the land, and we can learn a lot about that from indigenous people, but we can't learn modern scientific civilizational practices for urban people. The technical details cannot be learned from indigenous people, except in the smallest details of agricultural practice to local grounds. But really, science is the urban civilization's technology of interaction with the world. And the scientists at COP26 were the most impressive people of all. They were the ones saying, we have to change, most emphatically. A group of scientists created a pavilion, and the pavilions included representatives. There would be one space for each nation in the pavilions, like a World's Fair or a trade show. There was one pavilion that was called the cryosphere. So this is to say the frozen part of the planet, the ice on this planet, were treated as if it were a nation. That nation is trembling on the brink of extinction. And if the cryosphere melts, the rest of us are not quite doomed, but are in terrible trouble. All the coastal cities will be drowned. Water supplies all over the world will be wrecked. The permafrost might release all of its methane and create a runaway greenhouse effect that would really devastate the world. So this is something that only the scientists have the expertise and the worldwide data collecting and the method, the scientific method, to pull together observations that no one individual can bring to bear. And also that the indigenous groups, although they invented science back in the Paleolithic and have pursued the scientific method in the usual way of trial and error, of observation and generalization, they can't, they can bring the spiritual values, they can't bring the data collection on the global scale. So as important as indigenous peoples are to our sense of our relationship to the natural world, that we are a part of it and it is part of us, we also need science. We also need international diplomacy. The emergency is so big and so dangerous that it's an all hands on deck situation. Every aspect of society has to be brought into the picture as being important to it, including agriculture. So I guess what I'm saying is that in a total emergency, we need totalizing solutions, and the stories are not yet being told in ways that are persuading urban peoples of the need for urgency. And when that happens, I believe that they will force their political representatives to legislate for the world rather than for capitalism. And at that point, that's our only way out. There is not a capitalist solution to this ecological emergency. We need to demand and invent a post-capital political economy and spiritual system that is capable of coping with the scale of the emergency. So with that, I will bid you farewell with great thanks. I do hope to visit Brazil and to meet you all in person. That would be a beautiful thing. And as I say, my wife is making the travel list, and after years of me traveling and her working at home, it's kind of her turn. So we'll see what happens in the coming years, but with luck and health and a reduction of the pandemic situation, I'll get a chance to visit you all in person someday soon. So thank you very much.
Muito obrigada.
Yeah, let me say thank you also to our translator and to Bruna for organizing. It's been a pleasure. Accommodations had to be made because of my circumstances here. Very much appreciated, and I'll hope we all meet again. Okay, I'm gonna leave.
Não, muito obrigada,
Thank you very
Stan.
much, Stan. Thank you, Eliane. Unfortunately, we have to stop and bring this to a close. We'd have much more to talk about, especially now, this last, these final remarks by Stan, but unfortunately we have to stop because we've run out of time. We could consider other conversations in the future. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to the technical team, and thank you to the translator, and thank you to Stan and Eliane, and everyone especially. We want to thank everyone who's attending and will be